Okay, so in this section, we're going to be building out most of our HTML, and we're going to do so using the Bootstrap framework, okay? So what is the Bootstrap framework? Well, essentially the Bootstrap framework is basically some pre-written code and pre-written styles that the open source community has written, and we can use it in order to structure and to build out our HTML. Now, why do we want to use this? Well, there's various reasons. First of all, I'm not really a front-end expert. I like playing with the front end and I like making great experiences on the front end, but I don't like to mess around with the very basic code and the very basic process of building out the structure. So this makes it very, very easy for us. Second thing is, it's very hard to create front-end code that works on every single browser, because every browser has its own very specific way of interpreting the HTML and rendering on the screen. And so you may have heard that, for example, Internet Explorer has, many times renders pages not as they should be, and there are other browsers which also, render pages in different ways, as you would expect. So this is a very tedious process, and Bootstrap has done a really good job in order to make sure that the looks of what you code is fairly similar in most browsers, or at least most modern browsers. And for me, the biggest advantage is that we can build up our HTML really quickly and we can be very productive. So that alone is for me the biggest selling point. Now, having said that, this course is not going to be a in-depth course about understanding how Bootstrap works. We need to know the basics, but we're not going to go into too much detail and explore, what different classes we can apply to make things look one way or another way. So I highly encourage you to go to getbootstrap.com and read about all of the things that we're going to be implementing and make sure you understand them if you want to understand them. And I encourage you to do so. It's very useful. And we will be customizing a couple of things on the Bootstrap framework, but like I said before, we're not going to go into too much detail because I think our time is better spent if we learn how to implement this framework and see how we can make our application actually work, instead of, getting into the process of making it look nicer and structure, really, really well and all that. I think that comes after creating a functioning application, okay? Okay, so the basics about Bootstrap. The very basic thing you need to learn is how the grid system works, okay? The grid system is basically a system of defining the structure of your page. So here we see that they say that the Bootstrap works with 12 columns. And essentially what this means is that on the page, you have always available to you a space of 12 invisible columns. And these 12 columns span from the very left of your screen to the very right of your screen. So in all of this space, we can imagine there are 12 invisible columns, each of equal width. And the way we define the width of each element is using proportion of these 12 columns. So imagine this whole block here, this one here, I would say is maybe, maybe 10 columns wide out of 12. So this would be maybe a width of 10 out of 12 columns, okay? So the class that you could use to define this width would be col, which defines the width in columns. And then for which screen size you are designing, so XS is extra small, then there is SM, which is small, MD for medium, and LG for large. So this defines the size of the screen. So we're going to be designing for LG because, well, my laptop screen in this case, and I imagine most of your screens are, of a normal width, so that width is already LG, type of LG, okay? And then the number of columns we want to span across. Okay, so there's a bunch of more documentation about this, and here we can actually see a visual example about how a 8 medium column width spans over up to here, and then the 4 remaining columns spans to the rest of the width. And by the way, you can even nest the columns inside of columns. So, I mean, if the entire screen is 12 columns wide, and this may be more or less some 10 out of the entire width of 12, then they have nested these columns inside of the, let's say, the 10 out of 12 width. So you can go in and inside and nest the widths into each other. Okay, great. So we're going to be using a component. So you can find it under the, let's go to the very top. You can find on the Components tab, we're going to be using a navbar as our navigational item. And essentially this is just a bar at the very top of the screen, which will hold our links and the name of our site, so on and so forth. So we're just going to go ahead and copy this example code and use it on our site. And we will modify this code as we go along, okay? So to do this, instead of copying it here in our main, I'm going to, in order to try and keep it as clean as possible, I'm going to create a new folder inside of templates and call it Commons. And inside of Commons, I'm going to create a HTML file called navbar. Okay, so this file will hold all of the code for our navbar. Now, this is personal preference, but I prefer to have bigger indentations. So I'm going to select all the code, hit Command-Alt-L, and I'm going to re-indent the code. So PyCharm re-indents the code for us. So now the last thing we need to do to actually make this visible on the site is to include it in our main. So here we can open up the curly brace and %sign and say include, and we can go to the Commons folder /navbar.html, and we can see if this is working. So let's go back to our application, refresh, and we see this is working. Okay, great. Okay, so the first thing I want to change up here is I want to make this navbar fixed at the top. So even if we scroll down, this navbar for me, I like it when it stays up at the top. So now we can't see this effect because we can't scroll. There's not enough content to scroll. But you know, just trust me, this would disappear off the screen if we scroll down. So to do this, we simply have to add one class to the entire navbar, and that is navbar fixed top. Okay, so if we add this and we refresh, we'll actually see that this hides behind the navbar. Okay, so why is this? Why does it hide? Well, this is because the navbar is now fixed at the top, so as we scroll down, anything will actually go behind this navbar because this navbar will be at the top all the time. Okay, so that's why this is hidden, and we will remove this at a later point. Okay, so don't worry about that. So the next thing I want to change up is the name of the site. So I'm going to call it Yum Search, and I'm going to point the link of when we click the name of the site to go to our home path. Okay, so just /. Next up, I'm going to delete all of these links. So you see link, then somewhere here, I believe there's a drop down. Here it is. And the drop down contains action, another action, something else here. And this is exactly what we see here. Okay, link, drop down, action, another action, something else. So I'm going to remove all of this because we don't need it. We're going to leave the search box and the search button, but we're going to modify them a bit. And we're going to change these two links to be actual links, and we'll change the content of them, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, I'm going to delete all of this UL, which is basically a list of links. Okay, there we go. I'm going to leave this as is. And here I'm going to delete my dropdown, and I'm going to duplicate this just so more or less we have it all nice and ready. So we'll have two links here, which will be the login and the register link. And this will be just the search box to search for recipes. And we can actually go ahead and also delete this ID because we copied it off of Bootstrap. We don't need it. Okay, so now we want to modify this search box. Okay, we want to, or at least I prefer it if this gap is not here, and instead we can group the button to the input. And also we'll be changing the text of the button. We don't want text. We'll just use an icon from the Font Awesome library we imported, and we'll just put a magnifying glass to indicate that this is in fact a search functionality, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we need to do in order to group this input with this button is we are going to apply a different class which allows us to do this. And this class is called input group. Okay, so here it is. And the next thing we need to do is we need to indicate that some way that we want to group this button with this input. So the first thing we need to do is we actually have to take this out, because we see we have to put this inside of the div, because currently it's outside of this div, so which has the input group. So we need to put it inside. So I'm going to cut it and paste it here. But before we do that, we actually have to apply another class to this button. So to do this, I'm going to wrap it around a span tag. Okay. So there it is inside now. And to the span tag, I'm going to apply the class input group btn. Okay. So this input group, the same as here, but button. So this is input group for a button. Okay. And I'm going to change the type of button from default to primary. This will change the color of the button. So let's go back and see how this is looking. Okay, fantastic. We see we have gotten rid of the gap, and now the button is blue. So this is looking slightly better. Now let's delete this message and use a icon. So to do that, we type in the I tag of class fa search. Okay. And let's see how this looks. Okay, fantastic. Great. And I'll also want to change the placeholder to just for it to be more specific. So search recipes. And just clear up this space here and add some space down here to separate the form from the list of links. And now I can actually go ahead and modify these links to say that this is going to be the login and this is going to be the register. Okay. So let's see how this looks. Okay, good. See, our placeholder has changed, now our login and register. But I think it's nicer if we use some icons as well here to just so that it looks a bit better and kind of the icon indicates what kind of link this is. So let's go ahead and do that. So before the login, I'm going to implement an icon. So again, the I tag class fa, and I'll say fa key. Okay, so this will give us an icon of a key. And for the register, I'll use I class fa user. Okay, so let's go back and see how this looks. Okay, looking really, really nice.